welcome everybody to our Ask the Nurse series. It is brand new. This is our first session. We've had 2 seasons of Ask the Doctor that were wonderful. And then we got to thinking, like, the nurses are actually the backbone of our country's healthcare system. Like, y'all are the real deal. And so we're like, we should have done Ask the Nurse first. And so as soon as I started thinking about who I wanted to reach out to, who are these just powerhouse nurses, Jonathan, the first person I thought of was you. And that's why I wanted you to come on and for our premiere session. And so thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Angel. Appreciate it.
So a little housekeeping before we get started for our audience. We're going to start out, and Jonathan and I are going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask a few questions, and we are going to open it up for Q&A from y'all. And so if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there is a place where it says Q&A. It's kind of towards the bottom right. And if you open up that box, you can pop in questions, and I'll ask Jonathan the questions that you put in there. So at any time during the segment, and you have a question for him, just pop it in there and we will hopefully get to all of the questions. So without further ado, welcome Jonathan Bartels. Jonathan started out in healthcare 36 years ago and has been a nurse at UVA for 24 years. He's currently a palliative care liaison nurse for the adult consult team, and he's founder of The Pause, which we will talk about soon. In 2017, Jonathan was one of 6 finalists at the Schwartz Center's Compassionate Care Providers in the nation. And in 2018, he received the American Association of Critical Care Nurses Pioneering Spirit Award. And even aside from the professional accolades, he's just an awesome guy. The first time I mean it. It's always a pleasure anytime I get to connect with you. I talk to a lot of people in this space and have for years. And you are certainly one who, the first time we had a conversation, you left a deep and meaningful impact. So it was just clear to me, really, that not only are you doing such important work in the world, but you make your life a practice, which is very important to me. And I just could tell it without you even saying a word. And I just honor it and am thankful for you. So with that, our first question is, I would just love for you to tell us a little bit about the practice that you started called The Pause.
Sure. I started the practice called The Pause in response to, I did a retreat with Roshi Joan Halifax. If you all know her or you don't know her, I suggest to look her up. And Roshi Joan's done a lot of work with death and dying. Since then, we've become really good friends, and I really appreciate Roshi. I did a retreat with her called Being with Dying, and it's a 7-day intensive, and she's a pioneer also in resiliency training. So after we did this 7-day intensive, which is also something I suggest people look into if they can, we were given a mandate, because I walked away feeling like, man, I'm healed. And she said, what you need to do is go back into the place that you work in, and you've got to bring this back and help your peers. Not just hold it on to yourself, but give it to others and find a way to implement it in your area of work. And what I was going out of and into was a emergency trauma center. And I was an emergency trauma nurse at that time. So I went into this emergency trauma, and I'm looking around. I'm like, man, I just received some awesome gifts and healing, and learned about mindfulness, and learned about resiliency, and learned about self-care. How do I help my peers that are working in what I like to refer to sometimes as this hell realm? And so I looked around and I looked for gaps. And the one thing I noticed was, after someone died, we usually just kind of shut down, walked away, left it for what it was, and didn't do much more with it. And I thought to myself, man, that's a huge gap, because that death is not not just a loss. It's not a failure. It's someone's last rite of passage. So how do we capture that? And I thought about it. And one day I see a chaplain and they did a prayer. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. But the prayer, the words were not meeting my own heart. There were words that maybe came out of a different tradition. And I thought, the one thing this chaplain did was she stopped the room. I liked that. What I can do is modify what she did. And so what I did was I took that moment after a patient dies, and I asked one day, after a massive trauma that we had, where we worked for about an hour and a half, I said, before we leave this room, and this is after the patient's death was called, I said, before we leave this room, could we stop and could we take a moment? Could we just take a moment and honor this patient? Before they came in here, there was someone who was loved and they loved others. And could we also just take a moment to honor the work that we've provided, the care we've provided, and do this in silence, but do it in our own way? Would that be okay? So the whole room kind of looked shocked, but they said, yeah, that's cool. And they stopped and they paused. And that was the first pause. And that was the moment that I realized I had something, because people came up to me afterwards and said, I've never done anything like that, but that was really amazing. And I thought to myself, it was a Captain Obvious moment. Doesn't everyone stop and honor someone after they die? Now, I've known nurses in their practice and physicians in their practice over the years that have done this, but I think at least my collective whole, and the people I work with, were crying out for permission. And so I took that, and I kind of carried that ball further, and it's now become both national and international in practice, through publications, through people sharing, and through interviews like these. It's a really simple practice, and it took me a long time to figure out how profound it really was in the simplicity.
That strikes a chord with the part about that people were just like that your colleagues and all of us were just like waiting for permission to do these things that are so obvious. When Michael and I built Death Over Dinner, there were so many people that were like, people don't want to talk about death. And then we found quite the opposite. Like, it spread like wildfire, but in the best way. And it was just, that's what we saw over and over, was people just wanted to be offered a space and permission. And then it just all is like, it's like, of course,
Yeah.
And
again, it was a simple concept, right? It's, we make things so complex, and they're not.
I would love that. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, some things are complex, but I mean, but some of the solutions are not,
Right, like pausing and honoring someone when they die, or like talking about your end of life wishes. It seems so like, of course, but many of us been conditioned to just clench around things, right, instead of open and express, or open and pause and honor. Well, in that vein, Jonathan, would you talk a little bit about implementing the pause as a life practice, as well as a practice that's, happens at the deathbed, and how we can just really like take care of our own hearts and hold space for others too, when we're in the face of death and its impact?
Sure. I'll start with a story. A couple weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, I was on a unit, and a patient had died, and I walked in the room and I saw 3 chaplains walk by, and I said, would you guys mind pausing with me and doing a pause for this patient? And so the one chaplain who was new was leading around 2 other newer chaplains. And she said, oh yeah, we do this she was from New Orleans. And she said, have you all heard about this? And they're like, no. And so she's telling the story, and it was so cool to be an observer. And she said, I was in New Orleans in the ER, and I implemented, I brought this practice because I had heard about it, because a nurse actually from UVA which is where I'm from, and I am that nurse. She didn't know it, started the practice. So she proceeds to tell them this story. And then she said, when we implemented it, I remember my nurses saying, I don't like to do this. It makes me uncomfortable. It kind of hurts. And she said, that's the point. If we don't stop and pause, we don't stop. You don't have to embrace the full moment of the death, but you can take it in little increments. And that's really what it's about, is taking life in small increments, taking that moment that you are faced with and holding that space for that small increment of time. So it doesn't just pass by. It's not like a river flowing by at a mass rate. You are stopping it just for that moment, like a photographer would in capturing a picture. You're capturing that moment when you stop to pause. And so it was cool to finish that story. After she was done, I was like, yeah, I heard that nurse was a freak. And she looks up and I go, no, it was me. And so we had a good laugh and everything, but it was funny.
I love that part about you just being like, or her being like, that's the point. Because like, if we just zoom right past things that are actually deeply impacting us, then it's like little fractures have to happen inside of us to not feel that ouch. And so in those fractures, then we become these compartmentalized beings where there's not ease in our body. Everybody has that dis-ease with the hyphen, but it's true. It's like from these moments where we don't acknowledge the impact that life is having on us. And I love that you have created something that is giving people the access that's so simple, but to be able to take it in digestible amounts. It's like, no, just feel like 4% of that right now. And that's enough for it to start to integrate versus split you apart eventually.
And I can guarantee you, often the other thing we didn't mention is I've been doing resiliency training pre-pandemic and resiliency is a new buzzword. Resiliency is awesome. B, it's not meant for us to carry more work. And C, resiliency is when we need to make institutional changes. That's part of resiliency too. If we need to bang down the walls, we have to do that to make changes. So we're all aware of that with COVID. But what I want to point out with resiliency is that what you're mentioning are these cracks. So a lot of times what people do is they walk around with suits of armor, and they don't allow, and suits of armor are awesome. It doesn't allow anything in, but what it also doesn't allow is anything out. And so what I often say is, we have to be like a permeable membrane, and we've got to let a little bit in and a little bit out. And that's in order to survive. And if we don't, and I'm here to tell you, it'll come back. And it'll come back years from now. And I'm still processing my years as a trauma nurse in dreams that are still coming up. Those moments of panic when everything is falling apart and I'm trying to keep everything cool and keep my head cool. Even those moments of panic are still things I have to process today, but doing it in small increments, like you said. And like you say, with these cracks, I mean, if you just keep on cracking, you'll just bust apart. So you've got to have that kind of smooth flow in and out and find ways to heal. The pause is not a panacea. The pause is not going to cure everything. Like when I was holding a 5-year-old kid after he got hit by a truck, and we were performing the end of life with this kid. The pause didn't make me like walk away and go, woo, I'm all done. I still carry that 5-year-old kid. I still carry so many deaths. But the pause helps me to put pieces of that down. It helps me to feel that so that I can carry on. Because we cannot just keep taking on without feeding back.
With something like when you're telling me that, first off, I want to sob. But it's like something that's that monumental. makes me also think of like, I'd love for you to just talk about how intense COVID has been. Like, it's been this way for all of us, and we all kind of talk about it, but just like acknowledging, we're however long in, like 2 years in or something, but just for us to have permission right now in this moment to be like, COVID has really been intense, and it still is. And so I'd love for you to talk about how intense it's been. I know that you know firsthand about staff burnout and the importance of self-care, and really in this way, how resiliency is manifested.
COVID's been really tough all the way around, right? It's really opened our eyes to a lot of the fractures that we as nurses have taken on. We've been allowing them to abuse us for a long time, and we're done. And we're done being treated like that. And that's simply because they take advantage of the fact that we have hearts. And I'm not going to turn my back on a patient. I'm going to keep taking care of them. So it's not, that's one aspect of it. Death has changed completely. People dying alone without their families. It not only affects nursing staff. Imagine if you're the secretary at the desk and the family's calling and saying, I want to see my muma, my grandma, I want to see her. And you have to say, I'm sorry, the hospital has determined we are not opening visiting hours. And that secretary, who gets paid a lot less than we do, gets reamed by family after family after family. And then not to blame the family, because they're grieving and they want to be with their loved one. And why shouldn't they want to be with their loved one? But we've had to separate. When I worked during the AIDS epidemic in '86, it wasn't this bad, dude. I mean, we didn't lock people away. This is way different. We're putting people alone in rooms. We're having to adapt. We may be the only touch that patient has. My friends who work in the ICUs may be the only face they see. Them, the housekeeper, and the person that delivers their tray have such connection with them, but that's all they have. And then everyone else might be on video if they're well enough to see them. It's been really eye-opening, and it's been we're going to see these repercussions go on and on and on. It's not just going to be after the pandemic's over. We're going to have to see what is the backflow of all this, There was one beautiful, I remember one day, this girl was taking care of this older lady and she had COVID. And this young girl was 24. And man, my heart just exploded because she was sitting in the COVID room with this unconscious patient, holding her hand for hours. And I was like, dude, don't you ever lose that heart. Don't ever lose that connection. But I've also seen the opposite. I've seen patients who are COVID and nurses saying, man, I'm not going in. I mean, they got COVID. I'll go in when I need to. And sometimes the nurses themselves are trying to heal from their own issues, their own burnout, their own day-to-day having to deal with this, having to deal with people who are not vaccinated, having to people who deny the fact that COVID is a reality, deny what we see every day. That is hell, because it's bad enough that we have to take care of it. It's worse to be told it's not real. I have one friend who was an NP here in Virginia, and the family just refused to acknowledge that he was dying of COVID. They said, don't tell us this. You go and you look and you tell us exactly why he died. It wasn't COVID. And he every day he was assaulted that way by family who did not want to accept the fact that it's a reality. And for me, that's hard. It's hard for us as care providers. It's hard for people who are not in the hospital to see the isolation, unless their family members in there, and then they see it and then they get mad. And then we become the pariah. We're stopping them. We're not. We're trying to protect everybody. And I think that's been the hardest part, is we went from heroes to zeros because, you do your job, you go in there. It's like You're a firefighter. You go into the fire and take care of that. And I think a lot of nurses are like, dude, come on, stop abusing us and see that we are still the same people you called heroes. We're still those, and we're not lying to you. This is hard. It's hard to watch someone suffocate. It's hard to watch someone die.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because my grandparents, who were like parents to me, who raised me for part of my childhood, they died, both of them, from COVID a year ago today. And they let my uncle and me come to the ICU to see my papa once they knew he was dying. And I have been calling up there every day, twice a day, to the nurses station to ask him when I couldn't see him, and they would say things like, oh, he's doing great, he's, you know, his vitals are good and whatever. And then when I finally saw him, and I said to the nurse on duty, I said, there is not, like, the morphine isn't working. He is like he was gasping for breath for so long. It was brutal. And I was saying, can't you, from everything I know, can't we make him comfortable? Is there, you know, and I'm like begging, and this is the 45-year-old me, like, who has worked in the death and dying space for a long time, and who, because of working in this space, have worked with a lot of healthcare providers, and I have so much heart for healthcare providers. And I saw this like younger me who, like, when my dad died when I was 27, I like accosted his oncologist, and was, you know, and I watched this impulse that wanted to like blame them and wanted to, but thank God, like, I have the witnessing perspective in me that was like, this is just my pain trying to go somewhere. But it's like just remembering that y'all who are, you know, I've heard so many people say, well, it's like they just don't even care. It's just like it's their job. And part of me is like, how do you think they like could go on every day if it weren't some version of the middle path of like, you can't feel 100% of it, or you would just die as a nurse.
You can't walk around. That's why you have a permeable membrane. If I walked around with my heart out all the time, it would be crushed, eaten, spit out, and turned to ash. So compassion is something I know a lot about, and compassion can still exist, and you can still protect yourself at the same time. And that's what we try to do in healthcare. It's not just nurses, it's physicians, it's aides, it's the people who deliver your tray. Dude, I had cancer a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget this one guy every day delivered my tray, and it was a bad cancer, so I was there a while. And I connected with this kid, you know, and he never said anything but, what do you want to eat? And he always came in and he was nice. And I've had the pleasure to be able to go back to him and go, dude, you have no idea what you did for me. Your presence every day touched my heart. Just seeing you made me feel, you know, better. And now we become friends. We exchange books. It's cool, but that's, you know, it's that compassion can be shown in a lot of different ways. And yes, it is our job. And some days it is all that we can do to get up and perform our job. And sometimes we can't be Mother Teresa's. We're not all Mother Teresa's every day. We're human.
We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and one is dovetails from what we're saying. It's resilience and feelings. Resilience isn't about stuffing away those feelings. I wonder if we misunderstand what it means to be resilient. How does Jonathan define resilience?
So the word resilience, the root of the word resilience is resilio. My son's a Latin and Greek scholar, and he taught me this. And what resilio means is to recoil, to go within. And so I see resilience as the capacity to step away from, let's proverbially say, a burning building. And instead of marching in and continuing to march into that heat, to step back a little bit, to cool off, to get my wherewithal so that I can go back in and start and fight that fire again. It's that capacity to step back and then step in. And as you and I talked about in the beginning, when you said, how does the pause apply to day? The pause is that stepping back. The pause is taking that moment. Like when you did that for, your grandfather's nurses, you had the emotional intelligence to step back and pause, to see things in a different way, to be able to process that, and then to step in. That is the epitome of what I feel resiliency is. It's no way is it ever not to feel. The only way out is through. And I know that's a trite statement, but it's damn well true.
So true.
It's the only truth we have. There's no way around it.
Okay, one more question. I'd love to hear more about feeling the feelings and giving ourselves permission to do that.
And that's a wide open question, but I will certainly explore that. I'll give you an example. Say we're dealing, and I often teach new clinicians this, when you're a new nurse, and they often will say, sometimes it really hurts to watch that patient die, and I feel like crying. And I tell them, it's okay to shed tears. I said, the only problem is if you're crying more than your family is, who's sitting by the bedside, then there's a problem. I said, so it's allowing that feeling to be present. And then once you're away from them and once they're dealing with their own processing, and maybe you can step back later on in the afternoon. What I used to do is journal. And I got into journaling in a weird way, because I was one of 7 kids and there was only one girl in my whole family. And I married my wife, who is a journaler. And when we were married, I was young, I was 23, and I thought she was writing private thoughts. And like a guy who's never been raised around enlightened women, I read her book and got in trouble. And, and justifiably so, now that I know this. But that started me in the path of journaling. And so whenever I wanted to put something down to remember someone, remember whatever experience that was, I wrote it down. And then years later, I've kept my journals. I read back on those moments. So those moments and moments in time are still captured for me. And some are so deep and so harsh that I can only go back and visit little bits at a time. But I have that journal to be able to go and tap into that to do. And it's not a bad thing. So if that's one answer to a very broad question.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Thank you.
Well, so we're at time, and so we will wrap up.
Dude, I'm not done. I am not done.
Brother, bring it on.
Let's add another half hour.
Don't you worry, I'll be bringing you back for many other I really just appreciate your time. I appreciate your wisdom and just the presence that you always bring.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, girl. It's always an honor to be in your presence and to share space with you.
Well,
and with everyone here who I can't see. If I said anything that helped you, then I feel, even if it's one thing, then I feel like my day is a success. I always say that I always have to snort laugh once in a day to make the day fulfilled. But we've had some good chuckles, so I appreciate that.
Same here. Okay, well, until next time, and thank you everybody who joined, and we will be back next week for another Ask the Nurse. So please keep on coming back.
Thank you, everybody.
We'll see y'all soon.